Let's begin Chapter 10, our chapter on motivation and emotion. Let's start by defining motivation. We will use the definition that these are the factors that influence the initiation, in other words, when we start a behavior, the direction, in other words, the form the behavior takes, the intensity, in other words, how much gusto you put into the behavior, and persistence, how long you do it before you decide enough is enough. So initiation, when you start a conversation, when you start studying, when you start a nap, when you start a walk. Direction, well, if you want to eat, what will you eat? If you're going to text, who will you text? If you're going to go see a movie, what movie? And so on. Intensity, how much energy do you put into it? Do you do it with your total might, or do you kind of just do it? Are you trying to win the race, or just pass the finish line? Are you trying to get the highest grade in class, or just pass? You get the idea. Persistence, how long you do it before you cease. How long do you text before you cease texting? How much do you eat before you say enough? How long before you exercise before you say, oh, I definitely have had enough, and so on. So motivation would be the factors that influence the initiation, direction, intensity, and persistence. On the next slide, we'll see if you really understand this or not. Identify each of the four examples. When you think you've identified these four individuals in terms of their component of motivation, please move to the next slide. So before I give you the answer, please reconsider each of your four answers in light of the information that's been highlighted. You might need to change one or two. So for Tom, it was the direction. For Fatima, persistence. For Elena, intensity. For Tamika, initiation. Motivation can be influenced by both extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Extrinsic refers to external focus, behaviors done for external rewards. Intrinsic factors refer to internal focus, behavior done for its own sake. For the example below, for each one, determine if it's primarily extrinsic or intrinsically motivated. So learning for learning's sake, intrinsic. For money, definitely extrinsic. Prestige, extrinsic. To avoid punishment, extrinsic. For praise, also extrinsic. Mastery, for the joy of mastering, intrinsic. For the pure enjoyment of the activity, also intrinsic. To enhance your job skills, extrinsic. For personal growth, intrinsic. Let's consider another influence on motivation, locus of control. It's a belief system. Some people have an internal locus. They believe that they are largely in control of their life outcomes, that what they do matters and has a significant impact. Other people do not share this belief system. They have an external locus. They believe that factors outside of their own lives have the biggest say on their life, and often what they do has very little effect. So obviously, having one belief system or the other can greatly impact a person's likelihood to try to have impact on their own behaviors, on their own life. Does a person believe that their studying will have effect? Does one believe that their work will have an effect? On the next slide, let's see if we understand these concepts. Little check-out concepts, if you will. So let's pretend these three students have just taken their first test. The class doesn't matter. It could be math, sociology, psychology, economics. And let's say that each one of these students has failed the first test. Determine if each one of these students has an internal or external locus. So Jody blamed her failure on her teacher's bad teaching. Jody clearly has an external locus. As a teacher, I would not be hopeful for Jody passing this course. If she sees her bad grade as the fault of her teacher, there's nothing that she can do probably to pass the course. She won't adjust her studying, she won't adjust her techniques. So this external locus can be an extreme detriment to Jody's success. Deshawn, on the other hand, blames his grade on his poor study habits and attendance, clearly an intrinsic locus, and I would be very hopeful for Deshawn passing the course. If he realizes his attendance is poor, hopefully he will adjust that and miss no future classes. If he needs to work on his study habits, perhaps he'll go to our learning center on our 4th floor, I believe, off the top of my head, and ask for help on study habits. They'll give him impromptu workshop on it on a one-to-one basis. And again, Deshawn is very likely to pass the course. Oh, I just thought about it. 4th floor is the testing center. 5th floor would be the learning center. Now, Raphael is going to blame his failure on his usual bad luck. Definitely an external locus. And again, I wouldn't be particularly hopeful for Raphael passing the course because his behaviors won't change his luck. So people with internal locus will modify their behaviors as necessary to achieve their outcome. People with external locus, in other words, external loci, are less likely to believe they can impact their outcomes and often will not try. I just want to add in terms of failing and passing, if you find yourself confused in a course, get help at that point. Join a study group, form a study group, visit the teacher with specific questions, get a tutor. There can be weekly tutors that you schedule, or they can be drop-in tutoring. Additionally, we have many services at the college designed to help you to achieve success. Remember, you can go to the services part on your Blackboard and see some of the different offerings of the college. Your success coaches can be on your team. There are many people all pulling for you, so you do have to just reach out to them and they will do everything they can to help you pass. Your success is our success. Let's consider another influence on motivation, locus of control. It's a belief system. Some people have an internal locus. They believe that they are largely in control of their life outcomes, that what they do matters and has a significant impact. Other people do not share this belief system. They have an external locus. They believe that factors outside of their own lives have the biggest say on their life, and often what they do has very little effect. So obviously, having one belief system or the other can greatly impact a person's likelihood to try to have impact on their own behaviors, on their own life. Does a person believe that their studying will have effect? Does one believe that their work will have an effect? On the next slide, let's see if we understand these concepts. A little check of concepts, if you will. Let's now consider theories of motivation. We'll start with the old one, the oldest. Instinct theory. It was proposed by the early great psychologist, the first functionalist, William James. Instincts were defined as species-specific, non-learned patterns of behavior. So in other words, built-in behavior patterns. The problem is humans don't really have instincts. We use the phrase quite a bit, the mothering instinct, but any new mother knows that there's a tremendous amount of learning that has to happen. Maybe the learning is based on her helping to raise her siblings. Maybe it's from intensive help from her mother and aunts, her mother-in-law, friends, reading books. Maybe her partner has already had children. So we don't have mothering instincts. When we see the Harlow attachment film later in the course, you'll see the baby monkey that was raised by Harry Harlow in total isolation. When these monkeys were not capable of having sex, when they were artificially bred, they would either neglect the babies to the point that the researchers had to intervene lest the baby die, or would actually attack the babies. Again, we do not, as primates, have instincts, though we use the phrase, we do not have instincts. So our conclusion, this theory is historical, but not really useful in terms of understanding modern human motivation. Let's consider another older but more useful theory, at least when it comes to biologically based motivation. This theory is called drive theory. It states that when a biological system lacks homeostasis, in other words, the necessary balance, a drive is created, and that drive motivates behavior. For example, if you're dehydrated, that dehydration creates a drive, thirst, which motivates behavior, maybe going to a soda machine and buying a can, or going to the fountain. Can you think of others? Probably easily. If you're cold, that creates the drive of needing to take care of that, to increase body heat, a desire for warmth, and that might motivate you to turn up the heat or put on a sweater. So useful in terms of biologically based needs, but that would be its limitation. Let's consider an offshoot of drive theory, arousal theory. In this theory, it says we are motivated to seek the optimal, in other words, the best level of arousal. We don't like being under-aroused. We don't like being over-aroused. For example, if you're maybe under-aroused, you're bored, you're under-aroused, maybe you'll go for a walk, study class notes, listen to upbeat music, text a friend. But perhaps you're not under-aroused, perhaps you're over-aroused. You're getting too much stimulation. Well, then maybe you'll listen to calming music, maybe go for a walk, maybe study a text, or text a friend. You notice the same behaviors can have both calming and stimulating effects. And I did choose reading a textbook for a specific reason. Clearly, if you're bored, well, you could probably benefit from studying. But sometimes when you're over-aroused, you have too many stressors in your life, whether it's job-related, COVID-related, relationship-related. Sometimes doing something productive gets your mind off that overstimulating and negative aspect of your life, and will have significant calming effects. Sometimes people think that they're too stressed to work, too stressed, too over-aroused, but actually it can often be a very calming effect, a very settling effect. Let's now consider incentive theory. It focuses on external goals that come in the form of three possible conflicts: approach, avoidance, and approach-avoidance. Let's start with approach. This is when we have to choose between two or more pleasant choices. Next is avoidance, when we have to choose between two or more unpleasant choices. We'd rather both pass on both of them, but we can't. Take a moment and list in your mind, and hopefully in your notes, several possible approach conflicts and several possible avoidance conflicts. So for approach, you're going out to the movies and they all sound great. Which will you choose? You have 3 offers to go on a date on Friday night. They all sound great, but you find it difficult to do more than one date a night. Which one will you choose? 5 colleges want you. Which one will you choose? There's 3 shirts there. You only have money for one. You look great in all 3. Which one will you choose? So again, choosing between 2 or more pleasant choices. Next, avoidance. Let's say that you have a toothache and you also greatly dislike dentists. Which one will you choose? You either have to choose living with the toothache or seeing the dentist. Let's say that you're not thrilled with studying, but you're not thrilled with F's. Well, you have to choose one or the other. I hope you choose studying. You don't enjoy exercise, but you don't enjoy being overweight or having health problems. Well, which one will you choose? Lack of exercise or maybe gaining a little bit of weight? And so on. Let's say that you have to take a math course and you're not thrilled with math. Which one will you choose? I should mention for other people that will be an approach conflict. They love math. They can only take 1 or 2 in their program. Which one will they choose? Okay, you get the idea. Let's move on to the third one, the one that students often get wrong on tests because they're not thinking. Hopefully this will not be you. Most students approach avoidance and say, choosing between a good possible outcome, a good possible choice, in other words, and a bad possible choice. Would that be a difficult choice for a normal human being, choosing between something positive and negative? For example, if I have you choose between me giving you $50 or poking you in the eye with my finger, is that going to be a hard choice? Hopefully not. So it can't be that. And yet on so many tests, that's what students tell me. This instead is one action which has both good and bad. If you accept it, you get the good and the bad. If you pass on it, you not only lose the bad aspects, but the good. Perhaps you have a significant other. There must be a few things about him or her or they that drives you crazy. But if you send them packing, you lose all their good. You keep them around, you keep the bad. You get the idea. Buying a new car might be wonderful, but you also have to accept the paying for it and the insuring of it. So one thing that's got both good and bad to it. Let's briefly consider Freud's perspective on personality. So remember back to chapter 1. What was the term for Freud's perspective? Either dynamic or analytic. Either one is correct. Freud's perspective emphasized unconscious conflicts motivating our behavior. Specifically, unconscious conflicts between the three elements of personality or mind. Think a moment and see if you can remember these three terms often associated with Freud. These conflicts would be between the id, the ego, and the superego. Although I'd love to define them for you right now, we'll save that to the personality chapter. So now let's consider Maslow's hierarchy of need. Hopefully you know what the term hierarchy means. It's a ranking, it's an ordering. Think of some things that are in hierarchies for a moment. Oh, actually go ahead and do it. Okay, so the military is in a hierarchy, different ranks. Teachers are ranked, full professors, associate, assistant, and so on. The royalty are ranked, colleges are ranked. So this is a ranking of human needs. According to Maslow's hierarchy, we start at the bottom, the most basic, physiological. You can use the word biological if you prefer, things that you biologically need for your survival. What would they be? Well, obviously, sustenance, food, water, fluids, but also air. Also to maintain a proper heat and cold, so the proper temperature. For humans, I would argue that touch is a physiological need. If humans do not receive touch, they can actually be less well off because of it. Maslow includes sex in this particular level. I would buy it for the species, but not for the individual. Next, after we've met our physiological needs for the moment, we move on to safety and security. Think of all the many things we do every day, every week, every month to increase our safety or maintain it. Anything from proper footwear so we don't injure ourselves, to driving on tires that are not bald, to following driving rules, to locking doors and windows, to not eating spoiled foods, and so on, to maybe getting a dog. So all things designed to increase our safety. I hope your batteries and your fire detectors are good. I actually need to check mine. Next, we're going to call it love and belongingness. They call it belonging and social connection, but loving belongingness. So humans need to interact with other humans. One of the most severe punishments of prison would be solitary. Right now during COVID, as I narrate this, people are having difficulties because of their social connections being cut. So it is a human need. Next, esteem. You'll notice it doesn't say self-esteem, it says esteem. Esteem initially comes from others. Our parents, when they hold us, literally, I hope they hold us with esteem, thinking we're great, fabulous, stupendous, terrific. And we eventually learn that we are worthy. So from esteem from others, we hopefully build on it and create self-esteem. The last term is self-actualization. We learned that earlier in the course when we talked about the two humanistic psychologists, Maslow and Rogers. Self-actualization, to borrow an old Army campaign slogan, being all that you can be. Taking your unique combination of gifts, talents, skills, and doing the most possible with them. So Maslow said we're motivated to start at the most basic level of needs. Once that's solved for the moment, then we can work on the other levels. The criticism of his theory, though, is that we work on these levels obviously overlapping much at the same time. And people who do not even have basic food and shelter needs are still concerned with safety, belonging, esteem, and so on. So it's still a very useful way of looking at motivation, and you'll be surprised perhaps how many classes this pops up in, even non-psychology classes, everything from nutrition to economics and so on. So might as well learn this and get out of the way, because you're probably going to need it more than once during your college career, and might be able to apply it again to your own life. If you're puzzled why you're having trouble reading these words, they're in Italian. I assume you can't read Italian, I can't. I wanted you to see if you could actually remember these, since we do have a rapidly approaching test this week. So go ahead and see if you can remember these all before you click to the next listening icon. So is the bottom one psychological needs or physiological? Hopefully you said physiological. Next, safety needs. Middle, love and belongingness. Approaching the top, esteem of all varieties, not self-esteem, but esteem of all types. And the top, the most humanistic of them all, self-actualization. How did you do? Now let's focus on the other half of the chapter, the emotion component. Most people who study emotions have identified 6 or sometimes 7 basic foundational emotions. Obviously, we have many more emotions than 6 or 7, but see if you can think of the basic 6. Most students get to 4 easily and have trouble on 5 and 6, but give it a try. Let's see how you do. Students often forget surprise and disgust. That's not too surprising. We probably use these far less frequently than the other emotions. So one of the early psychologists to study emotions went to cultures they had never seen, outsiders, and with the help of translators, were able to show people pictures like this, and they were able to identify these particular facial expressions. So the recognition of these basic emotions are present in humans, one of a few definitely built-in bits of, I'd say, knowledge. Individuals also can demonstrate these particular facial expressions too. So again, these seem to be built-in emotions, universal to all humans. Some psychologists who study emotions have added on to the basic 6 a 7th, that of contempt. I like the picture on the right. It's a very old picture, but the person is showing contempt. Contempt involves a asymmetrical positioning of the face. So perhaps our 7th foundational emotion. As I noted, the basic 6 or 7 emotions are recognized by all cultures, but culture determines who can display emotions and when they can be displayed. They're called display rules. Consider maybe our culture 1950s or earlier. And men. What emotions were men not allowed to display? What behaviors? For example, maybe sadness. Under what very narrow, limited situations were men allowed to cry in public? Well, maybe an extreme loss, such as the death of a child. Maybe an extremely joyous event, such as maybe when he's walking his daughter down the aisle at a wedding. So, again, culture determines who can display emotions in what circumstance. So cultures have different rules. And although we humans have the same basic foundational emotions, there are also nuanced emotions that are not found in every culture. For example, consider Schadenfreude. I remember being introduced to this in the TV show Boston Legal 15 or 20 years ago. It's a pleasure you get from the misfortune of others, often from others that you really dislike quite a bit. So maybe somebody in class you don't like whatsoever, maybe they've been rude to you and many people, maybe they do poorly on a test and you feel some degree of satisfaction. Or maybe you see somebody who was tailgating you and driving very aggressively, maybe you see them down the road pulled over and getting a ticket and you feel a little bit of pleasure. Well, that is a nuanced emotion, not found in every culture. And for example, our culture, we'd have to use a phrase to describe this, versus the Germans have one single word for it. The most famous of all the emotion researchers by far is Paul Ekman. He wanted to figure out if emotions were learned culturally or they were built into our genetics in terms of evolution. He found a culture in Papua New Guinea that had never seen outsiders, virtually none. And he wanted to find out if they would show the same facial expressions that we would under the same circumstance, and if they could recognize the same facial emotions. So they had them listen to various scenarios and had them point to a picture that would correspond to that situation. For example, if a friend dropped by from a local village, if a child had died, if you were about to fight, you were walking in the jungle and accidentally stepped on a smelly, dead, rotted pig. And they showed the same facial expressions that we would display. Then they flipped it, show us what your face would look like if you're about to fight, if a child had died. And again, they displayed the same facial expressions that we would, suggesting a strong evolutionary heritage in terms of the recognition and the natural display of emotions. As I noted, the basic 6 or 7 emotions are recognized by all cultures, but culture determines who can display emotions and when they can be displayed. They're called display rules. Consider maybe our culture 1950s or earlier, and men. What emotions were men not allowed to display? What behaviors? For example, maybe sadness. Uh, Under what very narrow, limited situations were men allowed to cry in public? Well, maybe an extreme loss, such as the death of a child. Maybe an extremely joyous event, such as maybe when he's walking his daughter down the aisle at a wedding. So, again, culture determines who can display emotions in what circumstance. So cultures have different rules. And although we humans have the same basic foundational emotions, there are also nuanced emotions that are not found in every culture. For example, consider Schadenfreude. I remember being introduced to this in the TV show Boston Legal 15 or 20 years ago. It's a pleasure you get from the misfortune of others, often from others that you really dislike quite a bit. So maybe somebody in class you don't like whatsoever, maybe they've been rude to you and many people, maybe they do poorly on a test and you feel some degree of satisfaction. Or maybe you see somebody who was tailgating you and driving very aggressively, maybe you see them down the road pulled over and getting a ticket and you feel a little bit of pleasure. Well, that is a nuanced emotion, not found in every culture. And for example, our culture, we'd have to use a phrase to describe this, versus the Germans have one single word for it. So what is the biological basis of our emotions? Parts of the limbic system are key structures. We've already discussed many of these structures in class, the ones that are not particularly pivotal in emotions. Let's consider the amygdala shown on this particular figure. The amygdala is essential for strong fear and terror. If it's stimulated, a research animal such as a rat will be terrified. When you turn off the stimulation, the rat will immediately turn to normal. Let's consider a structure not shown on this particular overhead, that of the septum, and a tragic case study that goes with it. In the days before mass shootings were commonplace, in 1966, Charles Whitman went to the University of Texas Tower with his high-powered rifle and started shooting the people there. The day before, he had stabbed his mother and wife to death. During his shooting rampage, he shot 16 people fatally and wounded 31. And after he killed himself, upon autopsy, they found a very large tumor on his septum, constantly stimulating the septum, constantly causing feelings of rage. He actually, in his letter, asked for an autopsy to be performed to see if there was something abnormal occurring in his brain. He knew something was wrong, but unfortunately didn't reach out for help, though during that time period, our ability to image would have been greatly limited. At that point, for example, there were no MRIs, no PET scans. But in any case, you can see that the limbic system produces very strong emotions. I'm sure we're confident in the idea that when we're happy, we may smile. When we're sad, we might tear up or cry. But the facial feedback hypothesis turns that on its head. It says, when we smile, we feel happy. When we frown, we feel sad. How did they test this particular interesting theory? Well, they had subjects, such as the one on the right, put a pencil in their mouth in back of their canines using the muscles involved in smiling. In an experiment which was a variation of this one, other subjects had the pencil put in front of the canine using the facial muscles for scowling. And the control group had no pencil at all. What do you think the facial feedback hypothesis would predict? Take a moment and take a wild guess. Go ahead. It would predict that if we use the muscles in smiling, we will feel happier. If we use the muscles involved in scowling, we will feel negative. So they compared subjects taking a brief motion survey before doing this experiment and at the end, and that's indeed what they found. Now, in a variation on the left, subjects had the pencil put between their upper lip and their nose, which mimics sadness. And if you want to predict that compared to the control group, these subjects felt sad at the end of the experiment, you are indeed correct. So when you're feeling particularly oppressed and down, avoid scowling, actually smile. A friend of mine in graduate school way back when would often use this. When I noticed her smiling, and I would often say, having a tough time, and she would agree, yes, she was. So this was her way to counteract some of the negative feelings she was experiencing. Let's now explore the sex and gender topic, starting with basic terms. Sex refers to a biological classification. Usually it's determined quickly and easily at birth. The baby is born and there's an announcement, it's a male, it's a female. Gender, on the other hand, is a social classification, and with the social classification come expectations regarding expected behavior or traits. Now, gender identity is one sense of being male or female. People can experience this very differently, so don't assume everybody shares your same experience. It does not always match one's birth genitalia. On the next slide, we'll consider pronouns that people use for themselves, reflecting their gender identity. So a person may prefer he or him, she or her, they or them, or they is a neuter pronoun. Don't assume that everybody who wants he or him was birth sex was male. Don't assume that everybody who prefers she or her had a birth sex was female. So it's appropriate to use the term that the person prefers. A simple matter of courtesy. Let's consider cis and transgender. For most people, their natal, in other words, their birth sex, and gender identity match. They are cisgender. For others, this is not true. They are transgender. Many identities are included in transgender, such as gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, gender fluid, and other terms as well. Which term is correct? Whatever is correct for that person is correct for them. Simple as that. Don't confuse these terms with sexual orientation. They are independent of one's gender identity. So trans or transgender is a term used when one's sense of gender does not match their birth sex. Trans people are embraced in some societies, while met with violence in others, such as in the US. Let's consider the Two-Spirit. The Two-Spirit is the Native American term for trans status. Two-Spirits are recognized in just a couple Native American cultures. They are recognized in over 130 different Native American cultures. They have special status and special roles. In one culture, they might have a role similar to a medicine person. In another culture, a spiritual leader. In another culture, they get the fun role of playing matchmaker. In other cultures, they get to name the babies. I think this is a particularly interesting one. You'd have to treat this true spirit with extra careful respect, because what if you angered them and they named your baby something horrible? It makes me think of Frank Zappa, very famous musician, led the movement against censorship in music. He named his children Moon Unit and Dweezil. And I'll say it again, Moon Unit and Dweezil. So if you angered a Two-Spirit in that culture, you might get a name comparable to that. So the Two-Spirit is something revered, something respected. If you had a child that was a Two-Spirit, you'd be strutting your stuff saying, my child is a Two-Spirit. So definitely something valued, as it should be. This picture is of a Two-Spirit by the name of Wowewa. She was a Zuni woman in the 1800s, and for her culture, she was a woman like every other woman, but for us, she would be a trans person. An earlier slide noted that trans people are valued not only by Native American culture, but also by India in the class of people known as Hijira. So in India, you would be male, female, or the third legally recognized gender, Hijira. This is a group of Hijira women. They often find their employment in entertainment. In parts of India, if you were hosting a wedding, you would invite several Hijira as paid honored guests. They are thought to bring luck to the married couple. This slide shows you many cultures in which third gender and or trans people are legally recognized. The picture of a trans Taiwanese boxer. The Hijira term is highlighted so you can see how it's spelled. And you can see many cultures recognize either third gender and or trans. I could have easily kept going, but I ran out of space in the slide and thought this was just a bit of an example of how many cultures this is a culture normative term and concept. Just because it's a newer term in our concept does not make it foreign for most of the world. We too are learning the idea of trans. Let's consider the topic of sex reassignment, which can also be called gender reassignment, sex confirmation, or gender confirmation. It's a process in which the trans person changes physically and often legally their sex. Many people incorrectly assume that all trans people want to have the surgery and would if they could. It's a very personal and highly complicated decision, and the trans person may or may not choose to undergo this. If you meet a trans person or have an acquaintance that's a trans person, is it okay to ask them about if they've had the surgery, if they want to have the surgery? Well, I would tackle that question in this particular manner. Would you ask that same person questions about their genitalia if they were not trans? For example, would you ask a man if he was circumcised or not, if he was a new person that you just met or an acquaintance? Would you ask a new person or acquaintance their surgical history on non-trans related items? I would doubt that you would, so that would be my answer. Now, if a person is speaking in front of a class on the topic of trans, this might be an appropriate question, but again, they do have the right to decline it if they're not comfortable with it. But that would be a different situation than just randomly throwing this question at a stranger or an acquaintance. Time magazine devoted part of an issue to the transgender topic and framed it in terms of transgender people being the newest group in our country seeking civil rights. I thought it might be interesting to share with you how trans people are legally recognized in other countries. So Xgender or MX, Nepal uses the interesting other as opposed to male or female. New Zealand uses gender diverse, which is my favorite. No, you do not have to memorize these for a test. I'd just like you to know that there are different ways of legally recognizing the transgender status. Being trans is not a disorder. That being said, there is a condition called gender dysphoria, which is a mental disorder that comes from extreme distress related to the trans status. So if a person is unable to live as they think natural for them, that can produce extreme anxiety, depression, and stress. If a person is rejected by friends, family, or work group, that can cause extreme anxiety, depression, and stress. If one is accosted and assaulted by strangers, verbally or physically, again, that can cause extreme anxiety, depression, and stress. But being a trans self is in no way a disorder. A disorder can result from the great difficulties associated with the status in our current culture, but hopefully as trans becomes more and more commonplace, gender dysphoria would become less and less frequent. Unfortunately, almost all members of the LGBT community have experienced violence one or more times, either physical or verbal, in their lives. But among the transgender population, the threat of injury, severe assault, or even murder always looms. Take a look at these pictures of people that were murdered in 2015 that were trans. What do you see in common? I see two things. One is that these people are trans women. Also, these people are women of color. So the threat of violence is always looming amongst the LGBT population, but particularly amongst trans people. And for that reason, allies are always welcomed and always needed. Some people might have a hard time accepting a trans man who doesn't have a penis is still a man, and a trans woman who does have a penis and does not have a vagina or vulva is still a woman. If it sounds confusing, look at it this way. If a man lost his penis in a war or an accident, wouldn't you still regard him as a man? Absolutely. So his genitalia does not define his sex. So it would be exactly the same thing for the trans population. We've now finished the trans topic, and we are moving on to a totally different topic. Unfortunately, students often try to connect these two, which results in confusion and much inaccuracy of thinking. So again, trans topic is finished, and we're moving on to a brand new topic, intersexuality. So let's consider the intersex. These individuals are born with unclear, in other words, ambiguous genitalia. In the past, the term used was hermaphrodites, but this is archaic and old-fashioned and just outright offensive, so drop that from your vocabulary. Many students get puzzled and they say having both. It's like, no, not having both. Ambiguous. So the person, when they're born, the parents are waiting for that it's a boy, it's a girl, and there's no quick announcement. And there might be whispering, and then they might be informed that tests need to be made because they can't determine visually the sex of the child. So the structure there is not clearly a penis or a clitoris. It might be very, very small for a penis, large for the clitoris. It might have no urethra, even though it looks like it might be penis-like. There might be a very short vagina, which is close-ended. So again, the person does not have both sets of genitalia. That is not possible. Basically, it is an ambiguous state, but a normal state for humans. Many humans are born this way, and many species are born individuals in this particular manner. People that are intersex typically don't think of this as disorder, but just a natural variation of human genitalia. In the past, almost always, there would be surgery performed to correct this, so to speak, and make the genitalia conform to typical masculine or feminine genitalia. There are many problems with this. The surgery might not match the person's gender identity. Often there's scarring, often there's issues in functionality. So within the field of human sexuality, it's often suggested that surgeries not be performed and instead let the person decide when they're old enough if they wish to have surgery and what particular surgery direction they would wish to undertake